Good morning, good afternoon, and thank you for tuning in once again. This is the Beware the Day podcast, episode 12. My name is Ryan, and I want to thank you all for tuning in today. As always, I want to thank Black El Paso Voice for providing this platform. You can subscribe and follow this podcast on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Apple, iHeart, or Spotify. And if you wish to donate to the podcast, you should follow the links that are on your screen. As always, as a central theme of this podcast, which is creating and building generational wealth, if that is of interest to you, please visit my Facebook page, KRC Companies LLC. Leave me a message, and I will be more than happy to get back with you. We promote generational wealth by boosting profitability and cash flow for business owners and offering affordable healthcare solutions. Now, before we get into this week's topic, I've been doing something called the Black History Spotlight. So every episode, we will open with a story about an individual or a group of individuals or events in Black history. This week, I'm going to talk about the Sugarland 95. So you're probably asking yourself, who were the Sugarland 95? Sugarland, Texas was a major center of the convict leasing program. The city was home to the Imperial Sugar Company, which leased large numbers of convicts from the state to work in its sugarcane fields. The convict leasing system was a form of slavery that lasted from 1865 to the 1940s. It involved leasing prisoners to private businesses for dangerous and often deadly work. The system was used in the southern states after the Civil War to control Black labor. Now, when we talk about convict leasing, it's important to define emancipation and abolition. Now, if you've had any U.S. history at all, you know that the Emancipation Proclamation of 1865, signed by Abraham Lincoln, stated that, quote, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be thenceforward and forever free, unquote. The Emancipation Proclamation did not abolish slavery. It simply emancipated slaves being held in the Confederate States. Now, you got to ask yourself, why didn't Lincoln simply abolish slavery? Well, he believed that slavery was morally wrong, but he also believed that the Constitution sanctioned slavery. The Constitution includes key clauses that protect slavery, such as the 3/5 clause, which allowed Southern states to count enslaved people for representation in the federal government. Now, what was the 3/5 clause or the 3/5 compromise? Basically, it said that each slave was considered to be 3/5 of a human being. And the 3/5 compromise was abolished by the 14th Amendment, which was ratified on July 9th, 1868. So that was emancipation. Lincoln approved of emancipation as a war measure, but he postponed executive action against slavery until he believed he had both the legal authority to do so and broader support from the American public. The exceptions clause in the 13th Amendment opened the door to convict leasing. Now, what is the exceptions clause? And you're going to hear it here when I quote the 13th Amendment. Quote, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. It is believed that the exceptions clause was included to appease the former Confederate states. Actually, the 13th Amendment should read like this, and I quote, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. That's how it should read. But we had that exceptions clause in the 13th Amendment. So that opened the door to convict leasing. Southern states leased prisoners to private railways, mines, and large plantations. While states profited, prisoners earned no pay and faced inhumane, dangerous, and often deadly work conditions. In 1871, the Virginia Supreme Court ruled that a convicted person was a slave of the state. After a brief period of progress during Reconstruction, African Americans found themselves once again virtually defenseless. New offenses like malicious mischief were vague and could be a felony or misdemeanor, depending on the severity of behavior. What in the world is malicious mischief? It's very subjective. So basically, an African American could be arrested for just about anything under the sun. These laws sent more Black people to prison than ever before. And by the late 19th century, the country experienced its first prison boom, according to legal scholar Michelle Alexander, says she writes in her book entitled The New Jim Crow. The criminal justice system was strategically employed to force African Americans back into a system of extreme repression and control, a tactic that would continue to prove successful for generations to come. This meant many Black prisoners found themselves living and working on plantations against their will and for no pay decades after the Civil War. Like chattel slavery before it, convict leasing was brutal and inhumane. Across the country, tens of thousands of people, overwhelmingly Black, were leased by the state to plantation owners, privately owned railroad yards, coal mines, and road building chain gangs, and made to work under the whip from dawn till dusk, often as punishment for petty crimes such as vagrancy or theft. Now, in 2018, researcher Reginald Moore announced that he had found the remains of 95 Black prisoners who had died working in Sugar Land, Texas, in the early 20th century. Experts estimate their ages range from 14 to 70, meaning some would have been born into pre-Civil War slavery, freed, incarcerated, and then forced into unpaid labor again. More than 3,500 prisoners died in Texas between 1866 and 1912, the year that Texas outlawed convict leasing because the death toll was so high. The first bone was found in February 2018 by a backhoe operator clawing through the dirt on land owned by the Fort Bend Independent School District in Sugar Land. By the summer, the remains of 94 men and one woman, all African American victims of convict leasing, had been recovered on the future site of a career and technical education center to be run by the Fort Bend Independent School District. Ranging in age from 14 to 70, the inmates had muscular builds but were malnourished, their bones misshapen from back-breaking repetitive labor. They were buried in plain pine boxes sometime between 1878 and 1911. The city of Sugar Land established a task force to ensure that the remains of the Sugar Land 95 would be reinterred with dignity and their lives honored. So that is our Black History Spotlight for today on the Sugar Land 95. And if you want more information about the Sugar Land 95, simply Google Sugar Land 95, and there's a wealth of information there on this story. So before we dive into the struggle for equality and employment, let's just quickly recap what we covered last week. Last week, we talked about President Johnson and the war on poverty. We talked about the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964, which created the Office of Economic Opportunity. Now, we talked about how the Office of Economic Opportunity bypassed the New Deal welfare system and kept direct control of these programs at the seat of the federal government and did not delegate them to local governments. And we said that that was critical because in the past, federal programs were often left to the local governments to administer, and that's where the disconnect became apparent because African Americans no longer had access to those programs because local people were making decisions about who was entitled to what. We said that between 1964 and 1970, federal spending on job training increased from $200 million to $1.4 billion. We talked about affirmative action. We said affirmative action that phrase was coined by the Department of Labor to describe what unions had to do to get African Americans proportionally represented or else lose federal contracts. We talked about the Supreme Court rulings that established affirmative action as a powerful legal concept that propelled African Americans into unions, technical jobs, and management positions that had never before been available to them. So now, which brings us to this week's lesson, as we talk about the employment challenges during the Reagan administration. Now, unfortunately, affirmative action began to lose ground during the Reagan era. The Supreme Court ruled in a case in Memphis that firefighters with more seniority could not be laid off to keep African American firefighters with less experience who had been hired to satisfy a racial discrimination charge against the department. The Supreme Court virtually ended affirmative action as an employment tool in 1989. The Supreme Court ruled that when the plaintiff was a category of workers, for example, African Americans, Latinos, etc., the burden of proof is on the plaintiff to prove that the employer actually practiced discrimination and not a policy that could be justified as necessary to the employer's business. In another case, in 1989, City of Richmond, Virginia versus J.A. Cross and Company, the court ruled that a city ordinance that required contractors bidding on city construction projects to subcontract at least 30% of the work to minority-owned business was ruled unconstitutional. So that's just an introduction to what actually took place during the Reagan administration, which led to the struggle for equality in employment. So we'll pick it up there next week because there's a lot more to talk about as to what took place during the Reagan administration and how it affected the struggle for equality in employment. So next week, we'll talk about the same. We'll keep on that same topic, and we'll just call it Equality Part 5, Employment Challenges During the Reagan Administration. Once again, I want to thank Black El Paso Voice for giving me this platform. Be sure to tune into Suite 915 with Curtis and Fedora and Real Talk with Marcus McCoy. And by all means, if you want to support this podcast, the links will appear on your screen. Once again, I want to thank you for tuning in. I say it every now and then that there are more than 5 million podcasts in the podcast universe. Millions of people tune in every week, and I'm glad you chose this podcast to tune into this week. My name's Ryan. Once again, I want to say thank you. And remember, Black History Month is from January 1st through December 31st. Take care.